The world as we knew it suddenly came to an end, as the undead rose to claim dominion over our planet. The last remnants of humanity were left to survive and rebuild. But as it turns out, the new world wasn't all that different from the old. The greatest threat to any survivor wasn't the dead, but rather the living. From sadistic tyrants to twisted opportunists to broken men and women and even cannibals, The Walking Dead gave us some of the most chilling and intriguingly entertaining villains in television history. As such, I've decided to rank every significant villain in the main series, and I'll be going into detail for each and every ranking decision. So sit back and relax, because this is going to be the single best Walking Dead villains ranking video you've ever seen. Or at least I hope it will be. At the very bottom of the barrel, we have the Wolves of Virginia, with their upside-down, Majin-looking head-ass symbols on their foreheads. Now, I'm not gonna lie, they were pretty much just a generic group of pillagers who added nothing of real value to the story. They were built up to be a menacing group of raiders, but they sorta got low-diffed by the Grimes crew. And keep in mind, they got clapped while Rick's people were literally dealing with the mother of all hordes. These bums legit had one hell of a handicap, and they still got smoked. That one tweaker who was captured by Morgan, whose name I believe is Owen, did sacrifice himself in order to save Denise, after Carol shot him in the chest. And you know what? This sort of gave some weight or credence to Morgan's belief in Eastman's philosophy, that all life is precious and that every single action gets a quote return. But to be frank, this sort of plot development could have just been done with a random savior, and it would have been far more impactful and relevant to the plot and its themes. So of all the villains in The Walking Dead, these savages are by far the worst in quality and are also the least interesting. Coming in 16th place is Jadis of the trailer trash community. Now I gotta be honest with y'all, Jadis is actually not that bad looking outside of the show, but her character was largely just unnecessary and uninteresting. Not until The Ones Who Live spinoff, which sort of fleshed out her character a bit more. That being said, Jadis and her dumpster diving tribe of unhygienic weirdos really didn't serve any real purpose in the story, aside from being needless filler. And eventually, she was sort of just turned into a plot MacGuffin in order to save Rick's life for a spin-off movie that then turned into a limited series. So yeah, not really all that great of a villain. Her asking to bone Rick in front of Michonne was fucking hilarious though. Rumpelstiltskin's son from Once Upon a Time was a great one-episode villain who showed us the dangers that other people present in the world of The Walking Dead, basically manifesting what was hinted at in Season 1 by the Vatos gang, when they told Rick about raiders occasionally attacking their home. And yes, the Vatos gang got squad wiped by an unknown group, at least according to deleted scenes from Season 2. Rick's handling of Dave, who was quite the cunning foe, pretty much proved to the audience at large that he had what it took to survive in this new world. And it was honestly a masterclass in handling such a tense situation in both an effective and ethical manner. Ricky Dude Out Grimes legit only fired his weapon when it was absolutely needed. And even with that restraint, he managed to drop Dave and Tony with negative difficulty. It's good shit, for real. Tony, by the way, was just fat and got shot like a pig, which is kind of funny because he was the most aggressive of the two and the least competent. Y'all remember Tomas and Andrew? Tomas was great in the sense that this pseudo-tough guy with 2 active brain cells was a big shot in his prison home, but he wasn't shit when confronted by a hardened survivor like Rick motherfucking Grimes. By the way, funny as fucking killing the show for me, bar none.
Shit happens.
Now, Andrew had that dog in him. Home Skillet was like,
"Run, boy, run,"
and then came back and got Lori killed, while then putting up a good fight against Rick in the ISO. Memorable villains for sure, no doubt about it. These two really did leave an impact on the show, especially off-brand Kevin Hart, who kinda ended up killing more of Rick's people than the governor did in Season 3. But given Tomas's overt incompetence, and given how short-lived Andy's run was on the show, I can't place them any higher on this ranking. Although I'm sure some people would likely place Andrew higher on the list given that he got Lori killed. which for many fans is a big fucking win. Y'all, I can't lie to you about this. Dante was low-key more interesting as a character than Alpha and Beta. A true believer who wasn't lured to the light by the shining example of Alexandria and the compelling morals of the good guys, which is something we can't say for Gamma or Lydia. Dante was an excellent sleeper agent who clearly didn't want to kill Sadiq, but did so anyway, all for the cult of the Whisperers. But you know what? He loses points for killing the one man Carl saved. The one save that got Carl killed. Shitty writing, honestly, which was clearly implemented for shock value and nothing more. But yeah, Dante's pretty cool. I mean, he's not a better villain than Alpha and Beta, but he was definitely more interesting and also definitely filled with more potential. The man could have stole the show if he had been given a more prominent role in the plot. Like, imagine Dante never having his cover blown, and then imagine him surviving the demise of the Whisperers, only to still remain as a remnant ghost of the past who sabotages our group over a long period of time, as a dedicated follower of Alpha, who just can't let go of the now dissolved cult. This would have made him a top-tier villain, while also retroactively improving Alpha and Beta's legacy. At least, that's how I see it. Let me know what y'all think in the comment section. Dawn Lerner is one sexy-ass cop, especially outside of the show. Like, damn! But, in terms of her villainy, she's clearly struggling with her need to control everyone. So in order to justify said hunger for power, she's convinced herself that what she's doing is for the greater good of the Grady Memorial Hospital survivors. But clearly, the apocalypse has done a number on her mental state. She probably wasn't this bad at first, and perhaps her psychological degradation has caused her to become this diabolical see you next Tuesday. I honestly wish we got more of her and her crew, but what we got was ultimately a bit boring. And you know what? She really wasn't that much of a threat. And her crew was basically an on-the-nose manifestation of police brutality, and a condemnation of the prison industrial complex. Interesting shit, but poorly executed. Now, why is she this high on the list? It's because she's fucking hot. That's why. The idea of Special Forces soldiers in the zombie apocalypse operating as merciless marauders is a genuinely terrifying concept. They also had mad drip, and Leia was pretty fucking hot. She also had an interesting backstory with Daryl, but ultimately it didn't end in a satisfying manner. The Reapers also didn't really offer the plot anything significant either, in terms of theming and character conflicts. Nothing they offered was truly new, aside from the olive black tactical aesthetic. But because their introduction was hella cool, and because their aura was top tier, I've gotta place them in 11th place.
But that's really dumb. But he's so cool! But that's so dumb!
You know, I've gotta be transparent with y'all. I've only really watched the Commonwealth arc once, so my insight might be a little bit dull on this one. But Pamela Milton, in my eyes, belongs in 10th place precisely because her character archetype, or character arc, story, and focus, was done better by someone like Negan and the Governor. Unlike Carl's dream of a better future, or Rick's ethos of earning leadership through pain and struggle, Pamela wants to rebuild the world as it was, even if it means repeating the same exact mistakes. She's not interested in evolution, she's only interested in restoration. As such, Pamela is a foil to leaders like Rick, Ezekiel, and even Maggie. They grow, sacrifice, and challenge hierarchies, whereas Pamela hides behind her hierarchies. And when push comes to shove, she throws the lower class under the bus in order to protect her own image and the illusion of order. Lance Hornsby, on the other hand, is a bit more interesting because he's a corrupt political opportunist and technocrat. One could say that Lance is the sinister shadow lurking behind the Commonwealth's welcoming smile. He represents the danger of quiet corruption, the man who doesn't lead with strength or honor, but rather with manipulation, blackmail, and backdoor deals. While Pamela Milton clings to aristocracy, Lance builds power in secret, believing he knows best, even if it means war. He's the smiling face of systemic rot, the kind of man who weaponizes structure to get what he wants. In a world trying to rebuild, Lance reminds us that evil doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it wears a suit and shakes your hand. But just like Pamela, other characters have already done the same exact shit in more interesting ways. That's why he's in 9th place. Simon as a character is basically if they took Trevor from GTA 5, toned him down, and then threw him into the Walking Dead universe. He's a fantastic villain who really embodies the worst of the saviors. And he's also an excellent enforcer for Negan. Some of the most iconic moments in the Savior War only exist because of Stephen Ogg's terrific performance. I also truly enjoyed how he had some agency as a character, despite being the prototypical right-hand man to the main villain. He literally tries to overthrow Negan, instead of being some obedient lapdog. But narratively speaking, he doesn't really get to do much but fill a basic role in Negan's upper hierarchy of lieutenants. His rebellion is also unnecessary from a narrative perspective, despite it allowing Negan to set up a trap for the Allies, by cleverly utilizing Dwight without Dwight even fucking realizing it. Negan literally could have accomplished the same exact feat without having to beat Simon's ass. As a matter of fact, I think it would have been better had Simon's rebellion been more pivotal to Negan's final defeat. It would sure as hell be more believable than Eugene sabotaging all of the Savior's guns without anyone ever fucking noticing. It'd also be a bit more thematically appropriate for what was going on in the story at that point. But overall, I have no remorse over placing Simon this high on the list. Guys, I've got to confess something to y'all. I love Gregory. You see, The Walking Dead is basically that one timeline where he doesn't get killed in the mid-90s by the T-1000 sent back by Skynet, only to then end up having to survive the Walker apocalypse. Yep, that's right. Gregory was actually John Connor's adoptive foster parent. That being said, the dude is a weasel, an absolute coward who happens to have some political competency. One could even say that he's a professional parasite who had absolutely no fucking shame. He'd do anything to ensure his own survival, but he'd also do anything to hold on to his little title as leader of Hilltop, precisely because his fragile ego needed the status associated with such a position. He needed that accolade. In fact, he needed the crown so badly that the desire to recapture his old job cost him his fucking life. Greg also managed to always make me laugh when he called Maggie Margaret, while also always finding a way to be a total egotistical dick who couldn't back up his own delusions. His inability to best Maggie in combat was also hilarious. Top tier villain for sure, I don't care what anyone fucking says. Want to know who claims the 6th spot on this ranking? It's Joe and his claimers. These memorable villains were clearly bad and dangerously competent dudes with a simple but effective code, which united them in their quest to take other people's shit with zero fucking remorse. They were smart enough to survive with ease, avoided Terminus like the plague, and tracked Rick when his guard was down. They were also completely irredeemable, as they were fine with one of their own being a PDF file, while then also seeking revenge for one of their own, knowing damn well each and every one of them were immoral fucks deserving of death. Joe also forced Rick to dig deep into his soul in order to find the darkest part of himself in order to save his son. What Joe forced Rick to do, out of desperation, was so viscerally brutal that in the Ones Who Live spinoff, Rick considers his killing of Joe to be the most barbaric thing he's ever done. Joe and his claimers are undeniably top tier villains, but I kinda wish we got a little bit more of them. You know, I think it's kinda neat that I placed the claimers in 6th place on this list, and now I'm going to be placing Terminus in 5th place, because that's precisely the same order they show up in the actual series, back to back. Gareth and his Terminites are genuinely disturbing villains that almost succeeded in eliminating our group of survivors. They also had a tragic backstory, showing what survival and resentment can do to people. And when you really think about it, cannibals in a zombie apocalypse is basically what it would be like to face intelligent zombies. I mean, the fact that they lured their prey into a well-crafted trap, one which took advantage of people's desperation, and then slaughtered their own victims like cattle, is truly nightmare fuel. But that's not all. When our group managed to escape, these fuckers literally tried to hunt our beloved characters down like the main villains in a slasher film. This is a sequence of events that ultimately led to the iconic scene of Bob's leg being eaten while he was still conscious and totally aware of his surroundings. And at the end of this cat and mouse game, the Terminites are trapped in a church and then slaughtered by Rick and his crew, literally placing the shoe on the other foot. This was a fitting end to a group of monsters. But the thing I love the most about Gareth and his people is that they did not overstay their welcome and did not leave me wanting more. They were written to near perfection and as such deserve to be treated as truly top-tier villains. Imagine if we had a gender-bent Jim Jones in a zombie apocalypse whose most loyal follower is a literal Giga Chad that's simping for her. That's basically what we got with Alpha and Beta. The Whisperers as a concept are pretty interesting. They've accepted the new world and aren't trying to rebuild but rather accept the new status quo, thus evolving to devolve us into our most primitive but adapted selves. Their ability to utilize walkers as weapons, and their ability to live with the undead while living off of the land is honestly super intriguing. The whole walker skin mask look and the way they were introduced also brought the show back to its classic zombie horror roots. But the threat level of these fuckers is kind of overblown and really hard to believe. I mean, just shoot their legs and the horde turns on them. Throw a flashbang or tear gas into the horde and they get eaten alive. They also don't use any firearms or bows except for Alpha, who only has a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. So it's no wonder why I found myself struggling to suspend my disbelief when this wandering feral tribe of nomadic mouth-breathers managed to nearly tear the Allies apart. The Whisperers showed up post-Rick, and most of the damage they caused only happened because the Allies were disjointed and low on morale. So when you really think about it, they kinda had a narrative handicap, because they clearly weren't as big of a threat as the Saviors. Half of their leadership gets seduced and then murked by Negan, who then tag teams the fuck out of Beta with Daryl, thus eliminating their entire command structure. Plus, I'm not gonna lie, they overstayed their welcome, at least in my opinion. But even with all of these flaws, they were great villains overall. They managed to truly leave a meaningful impact on our survivors. Hell, many of our survivors still use their tactics. And because of the Whisperers, we lost Hilltop and a few solid characters. And we also got the very start of Negan's redemption arc. So yeah, flawed as they were, they've earned their 4th placed ranking. So I know I'm gonna get some hate for this, but I'm gonna have to place Philip the Governor Blake in 3rd place. But before I explain why he isn't number 1 or 2, I'm gonna explain why I think he deserves to be in the top 3. To start things off, I just want to say that the Governor is an excellent example of the subverting of expectations, particularly for fans of The Walking Dead who were coming from the comics to the TV adaptation. The Governor in AMC's adaptation shows that real power lies in the ability to form social contracts, or communities, rather than being a tough, jacked, and stupidly violent marauder. It also showed that a charismatic and seemingly well-intentioned man is more capable than some power-hungry thug, that soft tyranny is almost always more effective than hard tyranny. Simply put, Philip was dangerous not because he was stupidly strong when you properly power scale him, but primarily because he could unite and lead any group of people to do things they may not have done on their own, all while wearing a social mask that hid his true inner darkness. But when the time came for him to get his hands dirty, boy, he sure as hell could get things done. He was a crack shot, damn near superhuman in strength, turned into a slasher film villain when he chased Andrea down, and he folded Rick like a cheap lawn chair when they got into a 1v1. He also managed to leave a massive impact on the show, forcing Rick's crew to abandon the prison, killing Herschel, killing Andrea, and most of all, he's solely responsible for setting into motion the events which would lead to the most vicious and ruthless versions of our main cast of characters. And obviously, he was played brilliantly by the ever so talented David Morrissey. That being said, the Governor definitely overstayed his welcome. His character was supposed to show us what Rick could become, but it's hard to see Rick ever getting that bad because Rick isn't and never will be a fucking psychopath. So the comparison just fucking fails. He's just not as good of a foil as Shane was. His false redemption arc was also somewhat interesting, as it showed the difference between him and Rick. that Rick was never too far gone, but Philip was. But it also shat on Herschel's teachings, pretty much invalidating his philosophy far too soon in the show. Be that as it may, this false redemption arc was just unnecessary. I guess the writers needed to give the prison assault a second try because the first time was just a grand waste of fucking time. As a matter of fact, I actually think it would have been better to try to give Philip his false redemption arc in season 3. Andrea could have been the person to almost save him after Woodbury's first skirmish with the prison group, only for him to recognize that he was too far gone. This would have made the prison assault in season 3 far more meaningful. It would have also made Andrea's role and eventual death more impactful. It also would have made him a better foil to Rick, as Rick was losing himself in season 3 but managed to save himself, while we would have seen Philip on the same parallel journey only to then see him fail. And last but not least, it would have also ensured that the governor didn't overstay his welcome. At the end of the day, despite all of his complexity, Philip devolves into a comic book villain archetype, irredeemable, narcissistic, and too far drawn out. That's why I cannot, in good conscience, place him any higher on this ranking.
Girl, you got walkers all around you. They're in the woods.
That's right, ladies and gents, I've got Shane Walsh at number 2 on this list. But before I explain why he's so high up and why he's not number 1, I've got to address the lame brains in the comments section who will stupidly argue that Shane is not a villain but rather an anti-hero. Now, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a villain is a character who opposes the hero or who is either a deliberate scoundrel or criminal. It can also be anyone being blamed for a particular evil or difficulty. And according to Google, which gets their definitions from Oxford Languages, a villain is a character whose evil actions or motives are important to the plot. So it would be safe to suggest that a villain is a character who opposes the protagonist and is typically responsible for creating conflict in a story. They often embody evil, selfishness, or morally corrupt traits, but can also be complex individuals with understandable motives or tragic backstories. Given this frankly objective information, one can definitely assert that Shane is indeed a fucking villain.
But Captain Gold, he's actually an anti-hero. He seems like a villain because The Walking Dead is Rick's story.
No, dipshit. Anti-heroes generally don't go around trying to kill their best friend just so they can fuck their best friend's wife and have their child call them daddy. No matter how Shane felt about Rick, and no matter how important Lori and Carl were to his sense of purpose, killing Rick was never truly necessary. Plainly stated, Shane was a villain. That being said, what makes Shane such a great villain is that he just so happened to be Rick's shadow, a dark reflection of who Rick could become in the absence of his family and support group. And like any typical shadow, Shane begins the story as a good guy, only to then slowly devolve into a tragic villain, thus completing a classic negative change character arc. And what makes these sorts of arcs so compelling is that said tragic characters, like Shane, could have been saved at some point along their descent to madness. In the case of Shane, he could have potentially been saved by Andrea had she convinced him to leave with her, or by Lori and Rick allowing him to father Judith, or even by his own accord had he elected to leave the group entirely. When we pay attention to Shane's character, we see a good man who knew what needed to be done but lacked the strength to live with what needed to be done. A man who could not live in the new world without Lori and Carl, and hence who started to go insane without them. Being Rick's shadow also meant that Rick would eventually have to be the one who killed Shane, and in doing so, Rick absorbed many of Shane's darker attributes, without discarding the good within Rick himself. And in a way, this helps to validate some of Shane's philosophical beliefs, while also killing a part of Rick. As such, it isn't a surprise to see Rick is haunted by the ghost of Shane, an ever-present shadow which is mentioned by Rick late into the show and even during his departure from the main series. Be that as it may, many fans are obsessed with the authentically positive potential of Shane, to the point where they fail to see the grim reality of Shane. He may not have started out as a bad man, but he definitely ended up being one. So when I see some of y'all love the character to the point where y'all think that Lori was the real villain, I can't help but think you've got the same character flaws as Shane, and that you're probably trying to absolve Shane of his moral culpability. Because by acknowledging his villainy, or his moral bankruptcy. You must also confront your own failings as a person. Lori was definitely annoying and often immoral in her own way, and she definitely was a terrible wife. But she was objectively not a villain. Shane, on the other hand, was a weak man who needed to be given purpose because he lacked the strength to find it on his own. He was the zombie apocalypse manifestation of toxic red pill masculinity, while also being a sad simp for a woman who did not want him nor did not deserve him at his best. It really shouldn't be a shock to anyone that this type of man ended up going insane. In a way, Shane should be treated as a cautionary tale. You should honestly be concerned if you relate to him deeply. And I'm not talking about sympathizing with him or trying to empathize with him. I'm talking about you recognizing that you'd behave exactly like him, and that you don't think there's anything wrong with what he did in the story. Because you yourself are just like him. And none of us ever think we're the villain. Everyone thinks they're the hero of their own story. But truth be told, if you deeply relate to Shane, you need to take some time to reflect on what that really means, because it really should worry you. Shane is also easily the most overrated survivor on the show. He was never truly tested against other human threats. His only kills were against Randall and Otis, and he struggled against Rick in their first fight, only to then get masterfully outplayed in their final confrontation when Rick was actually going all out. He had a short temper and was foolish enough to actually think that trekking over 100 miles to Fort Benning was a good idea. Guys, Shane isn't the Punisher just because Jon Bernthal played both characters. With all of that being said, he's still the second best antagonist on the show precisely because his fall was so profoundly tragic, expertly executed, and because his impact is still felt to this day. Where the governor failed to be a convincing foil to Rick, Shane was and still is the best damn foil or shadow to Rick the show has ever seen. Now, before we get to the top villain in the show, I want to quickly discuss why Dr. Edwin Jenner isn't on the list. Dr. Jenner, despite attempting to kill the Atlanta group, did not do so because he wanted to actively oppose Rick or because he had evil or immoral intentions. He was just a hopeless man who thought he was doing the right thing, and he ultimately allowed our group to leave when they pleaded with him to be given a choice. He even went on to give Rick some important information, being that everyone is infected. I can see how some might view him to be a villain, and in the past I've personally viewed him to be somewhat of an antagonist, but that's only because Season 1 lacked any true antagonist, aside from the walkers themselves. But when you really spend some time thinking about Jenner as a character, it becomes clear that he really isn't a villain but more so of a plot-induced obstacle that serves to also shove existential questions in our face. Oh, and gee, I almost forgot. As for Merle Dixon, he was a total dick, but he really wasn't a villain. Even when he worked for the governor, he sort of just did so for the sake of surviving. His real loyalty was always to Daryl, and the minute he had the chance to side with his little bro, he kinda did eventually. So that's why he's not really on this list. Oh my goodness! We're finally here. The single greatest villain in The Walking Dead is none other than Negan Smith. He's charismatic and funny, brutal and intelligent, deeply impactful, sympathetic, and also a perfect foil for Rick during his respective part of the story. He's so damn good as a character that they kept him around for a successful redemption arc, and then they focused a subsequent spin-off series on him. Jeffrey Dean Morgan truly did an amazing job with this character. With that being said, allow me to now elaborate a bit on why Negan definitely deserves to be number one on this ranking. Let's start off with the ideological challenge he presents to Rick. With Alexandria now being our group's home, and with Carl starting to develop a vision for the new world, one which would center around building something better than the past world, Negan represents the dangers of returning to the old world, where might makes right and where the top percentile of earners, and politicians, maintain a disproportionate level of wealth and power over the rest of society. These sorts of people don't just oppress the working class, they exploit both their fellow citizens and foreign societies. This is exactly what the Saviors represent. They force their own people to work, annex and exploit other communities, and then they keep the vast majority of the profits for Negan and his inner circle. This is a society that has sacrificed all liberty for security, and they've garnered neither, instead being shackled by poverty. As a result of this failing, The unforgiving reality of the Saviors stands in stark contrast to the vision that Carl, and by extension Rick, has for the new world. A vision which is democratic and one which seeks to create the greatest good for the greatest amount of people possible. Whereas in the past our group has had to contend with foils like Shane and Philip, Negan presents them with the ultimate ideological challenge. If we cannot change as a species, in response to the new slate granted to us by the Walker Apocalypse, then we really all should have died in the outbreak. As in, we all really are the Walking Dead if we don't take this opportunity to build a better world. This is why Negan is the ultimate end boss battle for our survivors. It's why he's basically the Thanos of the Walking Dead, a threat that literally took a coalition of communities, and even defectors from the Saviors, in order to overcome. And to be frank, the Saviors and Negan should have been the end of the Walking Dead's main story. Now, as an individual villain, Negan works precisely because he isn't insane or unnecessarily merciless or ruthless like the Governor. He actually believes what he's doing is the right thing to do. But he doesn't realize that he's not only hypocritical in some of his views, but that he's also just merely managing the decay as opposed to truly rebuilding and creating something new and better. Negan also impacts the story in a way that no villain before or since has managed to do. He killed off two fan-favorite characters, managed to be the first to actually break Rick's spirit, and he was also the one and only villain our heroes could not defeat alone. The build-up to Negan was also masterfully done, and his reveal was literally peak television. And even with Season 8's terrible writing and pacing, Negan ended up being the one reason most people kept watching. His charisma also made him feel believable. We can understand how he built such an empire and how he managed to cultivate such a dedicated following. To the point that even some viewers of the show, to this day, actually think he was right. And let's not forget that he was also intimidatingly intelligent, often outsmarting our main cast of characters and proactively pushing the plot forward with a strong sense of agency. If it wasn't for the failures of Season 8's writing, I dare say Negan's position as the best villain in the series would be uncontested. Anyways, with all of that being said, now would be a good time to end this rather lengthy video. If you like this sort of content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell as well if you'd like to be notified when I publish a new video. And always remember that you may opine anytime if you feel so inclined down in the comments section. I'm Captain Gold and I hope to see you in my next Gold Standard video.